We may think power resides with presidents and prime ministers in palaces and parliaments. Not so. In today's world, real power lies in the hands of an elite group of unassuming men in anonymous open-plan offices. The men who control the world's bond market. Bill Gross is the boss of PIMCO, the world's biggest bond trading operation, which manages a portfolio of bonds worth $700 billion. Gross is widely regarded as the king of the bond market. Just call him Mr. Bond.
Bonds are the magical link between the world of high finance and the world of political power. Governments will always spend more than they raise in taxation, sometimes shed loads more, and they make up the difference by selling bonds that pay interest. But, and here's the magic, if you want to get rid of a bond, the government doesn't have to give you the cash back. You just take it to a bond market, like the one here, Tokyo Stock Exchange, and sell it.
After the rise of banks, the birth of the bond market was the next big revolution in the history of finance. It created a whole new way for governments to borrow money. The bond market funded the wars that plagued northern Italy 600 years ago. It dictated the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo and created the world's greatest financial dynasty. It ensured the defeat of the South in the American Civil War. And in modern times, the bond market has brought once wealthy nations, like Argentina, crashing to their knees. Today, governments and companies use bonds to borrow on an unimaginably vast scale. All told, there are bonds out there worth around $85 trillion. The fortunes of most of us, whether we like it or not, are directly linked to the bond market. If the bond market tanks, then down goes the value of our pensions. And that's a huge part of our wealth as individuals. In the financial crisis that has gripped the world since the summer of 2007, US government bonds have been seen as a safe haven for investors seeking shelter from the storm of falling property and share prices. So if Bill Gross were to lose faith in those bonds, it would hit the financial world like, well, a thunderball. That's why this Mr. Bond has become so much more powerful than the Mr. Bond created by Ian Fleming. And that's why both kinds of bond have a license to kill. War, declared the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, is the father of all things. It was certainly the father of the bond market. For much of the 14th and 15th centuries, the medieval city-states of Tuscany, Florence, Pisa and Siena were at war with each other. This was war waged as much by money as by men.
In Peter van der Heyden's Battle of the Money Bags and Strong Boxes, piggy banks, treasure chests, and barrels full of coins lay into one another with lances and swords in a chaotic free-for-all. The Dutch verses inscribed at the bottom read, "It's all for money and goods, this fighting and quarrelling." But what they might just as easily have said is that war is impossible if you don't have the money to pay for it.
And the way to do that, the ability to finance war through the bond market, was like so much else, an invention of the Italian Renaissance. Rather than require their own citizens to do the dirty work of fighting, each city hired military contractors, condottieri, who raised armies to annex land and loot treasure from the others. Among the condottieri of the 1360s and 1370s, one stood head and shoulders above the others. This is his portrait in Florence's Duomo, a thank you from a grateful public. Unlikely though it may seem, this master mercenary was an Essex boy. So skillfully did he wage war that the Italians called Sir John Hawkwood Giovanni Acuto, John the Acute. This castle was one of many pieces of prime real estate the Florentines gave him as a reward for his services. But Hawkwood was a mercenary who was willing to fight for anyone who'd pay him. Milan, Padua, Pisa, or the Pope.
Frescoes in Florence's Palazzo Vecchio show the armies of Pisa and Florence clashing in 1364. At that time, Hawkwood was fighting on the side of Pisa, but 15 years later he'd switched sides. Why? Because Florence was where the money was.
The cost of these incessant wars plunged Italy's city-states into crisis. Expenditures, even in years of peace, were running at double or more tax revenues. To pay the likes of Sir John Hawkwood, Florence was drowning in deficits.
This wonderful document in the Florentine State Archive shows how the city's debt had exploded from around 50,000 florins at the beginning of the 14th century to 5 million by 1427. It was quite literally a mountain of debt, hence the name, the Monte Comune. But from whom could the Florentines possibly have borrowed such a vast sum? The answer is right here, from themselves.
It was a revolutionary idea that would change the world of money forever. Rather than paying direct tax, citizens were now effectively obliged to lend money to their own government. In return for these forced loans, they received interest.
These debt instruments, simple lines in a ledger, were the original government bonds. And the wonderful thing about them was that if you needed your money in a hurry, you could sell your bonds to other citizens. They were liquid assets. What this record tells us is how Florence turned its citizens into its biggest investors.
This wartime expedient marked the birth of the modern bond market. Everyone was a winner. Bonds had saved the city-state from bankruptcy. The citizens were happy earning their interest, and the bond market let them buy or sell as they saw fit. It seemed as if the problem of public debt had been solved, allowing the citizens of Florence to turn their minds to higher things. But there was just one problem with this brilliant idea. There was a limit to how many more or less unproductive wars could be waged. The larger the debts of the Italian cities became, the more bonds they had to issue. And the more bonds were issued, the less valuable they looked to investors. And that was exactly the sequence of events in Venice. By the early 16th century, the city had suffered a series of military reverses, and the value of Venetian bonds had taken a hammering.
At the nadir between 1509 and 1529, Venetian Monte Nuovo bonds were trading at just 10% of their face value. Now, if you buy a bond when war is raging, you're taking a risk. The risk that the city won't pay you back or pay your interest. On the other hand, remember that the interest is paid on the face value of the bond. So if you can buy it at just 10% of its face value, you're earning a handsome return of maybe 50%. And that is how the bond market works. In a sense, you get return for the risk you're prepared to take. At the same time, it's the bond market that sets interest rates for the economy as a whole. If the state has in effect to pay 50%, then so do all the other borrowers.
The bond market had been invented to help pay for Italy's wars. But now, it was setting interest rates for everyone. Its rise to power had begun. Over the next 2 centuries, bonds would come to rule the world. This house was built by the financial dynasty that helped decide the Battle of Waterloo. The dynasty that produced the man they called the Bonaparte of finance, the emperor of the 19th century bond market. He is master of unbounded wealth. He boasts that he is the arbiter of peace and war, and that the credit of nations depends upon his nod. Ministers of state are in his pay. Those words, spoken in 1828 by the radical Member of Parliament Thomas Dunscombe, were describing Nathan Rothschild, bond trader extraordinaire and founder of the London branch of what became the biggest bank in the world. The bond market made the Rothschilds stupendously rich, so rich that they could afford to build 41 stately homes all over Europe. This is number 29, Wadsden Manor in Buckinghamshire, which has been restored in all its gilded glory by Jacob Rothschild, Nathan's great-great-great-grandson.
Well, he was short, fat, obsessive, extremely clever, wholly focused.